the 80s and 90s about keeping the Golan Heights because he wanted to have that advantage.
As Trump says, you got to have the height. That's what he likes to do. That's what he says.
So Jonas also asks, what differs in average settlers' living conditions to the Palestinians who are living inside the West Bank?
Yeah, so pretty drastically different. I think the unemployment for Palestinians in the West Bank is, there's different numbers and it's difficult to track in the West Bank and Gaza. I think in Gaza it's like 40%, but in the West Bank I think it's around between 20 and 25% around that for Palestinians, whereas for Israelis it's around 4%.
And how does that compare with the national average?
So for 4% for all Israelis, and in general settlers, now they're all kinds. People like to think of them as a monolith. I think when you think of settlers, oftentimes they're portrayed as the national religious with the kippah maybe, and kind of very tied to the land. But the national religious only make up a third of settlers. A third of them are Haredim. So imagine the economic difficulties that Haredim face with a lot of them not working inside the Green Line in Bnei Brak. It's the same thing in Modi'in Ilit, a settlement where a lot of Haredim live. And the same test, and then there's Ariel or Ma'ale Adumim, where each have like around 30,000 residents in each of them, and those are kind of basically no different than Afula or some of the other periphery, prominently Mizrahi towns that are in both sides of the Green Line. So but in general, the overall, you're very rare to find beggars or people who are homeless or experiencing homelessness in the West Bank or in the settlements. And definitely the national religious are far more affluent. They are generally more educated in terms of degrees. They're more educated. So I would very much confident saying that the unemployment rate is going to be even lower for Israelis in the West Bank than the 4% rate that the rest of the country.
And they're also under a different legal system as well.
Right.
They're under civilian courts as opposed to military martial courts.
Exactly. They're just not. They're technically, the military is controlling the West Bank, and to a certain degree, but the citizens themselves are very full-blown citizens, and they're treated, and they don't go to military courts or as Palestinians do, and obviously things like freedom of movement that is severely limited, that prevents a lot of the times businesses from flourishing, and that's why the economy is very, very monolithic, and the Palestinian economy is very much based on kind of most of them talk about like the construction workers are a very, very common job. Because options are very limited, because various other businesses have a hard time dealing with elements of military control.
Great, thank you. And just a side note, if we are not able to read the questions as we're on the broadcast, Jacob, you'll be available to answer them in writing, right?
Yeah.
In the comments. But Jacob's looking at his phone to see what the questions are, and I'm peering over too. And I understand it's light and snowy here in Sweden, and it's wonderful to see everyone who's watching. So Alisara Sandy Myers-Green brought up the question about this movement called the Two States and the One Homeland. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about that? I know it's fairly new, but it's gaining some traction. Can you tell us what that's about and what momentum it's gaining both within Jewish communities in the West Bank and Palestinian communities in the West Bank?
Yeah, so Two States, One Homeland, I think, was founded within the past 10 years, I believe. Mm-hmm. It's one group that kind of talks about the idea of that kind of says there's no borders, and both sides will have their own kind of government, and they will consider themselves, both sides will be sovereign. Israel will be a sovereign Israel and a sovereign Palestine, and there will be freedom of movement for everyone from the river to the sea, and it's the notion that the belief that there's no way to divide that the land is too important to each side to divide, and therefore we're just going to try to all live together. And it's basically it's a very small group that's kind of been pushing this notion, this solution to the conflict. I went to one of their meetings like about a year and a half ago, kind of just see what it's very, very small and very niche. Very few Israelis know about this idea, and I think it is, when people talk about possible other solutions, because the two-state solution seems so distant, and increasingly so in recent years. these are the idea of this, or Ruby Rivlin, the president, talks about the idea of some sort of confederacy. These are the kinds of ideas that might come to mind down the road. But for some, I think they need more star power. I think for now, the people that talk about solutions to the conflict are either kind of very much either one state on both sides, on the right or the left. If the far right and far left talk about a one state solution, they obviously look very differently. Or the two state solution, which is very much still dominant among both among the like a lot of the security establishment, both current and past. And until I think some of these old timers kind of start, or other people with influential voices start buying into some of these other ideas, like a confederacy, like two states, one homeland, which honestly does sound very interesting. They're not picking up, because I mean most Israelis have no idea what this group is, what this option is to the conflict. I think it's also hard for people to want to, because it is a compromise in its own right, because you're talking about giving up on the idea of like having one state that's only Israel, where it's kind of going to be one state that's both Israel and Palestine, and it'll be a lot kind of hard for people to wrap their heads around.
It's a big mental shift that a lot of people would have to make.
Exactly.
In both communities as well. So.
Right. On the other hand, it's not asking you to give up on land specifically, which a lot of people might be able to get around. But in terms of support for this specific group, and it's just not there yet. So maybe that will change when people start to accept that either a two-state solution or a one-state solution is either unrealistic or not a good solution. Maybe that people will start looking to other ideas like two states, one homeland.
Now, Ken Robin writes that he has many relatives living in various settlements, but he's from the liberal progressive wing of the family, and they have conflicting feelings on all of this. So he writes that he's always interested in hearing more about people who live in the West Bank and where there are opportunities to bridge the Palestinian-Israeli divide. And you've touched on a lot of that, but if you can think of more concrete examples, we'd like to hear.
So there's this group called Roots, and it's located in the Gush Etzion, southeast of Jerusalem, area in the West Bank. And basically what they try to do is bring Israeli settlers and Palestinians together through basically, they have like this, I think it's located on a small piece of land, a few dunams, just like a few acres, pretty small. It's and it's owned, and basically they offer Hebrew and Arabic lessons to the people that come. They offer it's run by someone who on the Jewish side, or a settler who was a student of Rabbi Froman, who used to live in Tekoa, and he was very much involved in these kind of peace work between settlers and Palestinians. So this is one of his students. So it's very much a religious-based kind of dialogue, and the Palestinian Ali Awad, I believe his name is also speaks about it through a religious lens. And so they also offer classes in addition to the Hebrew and Arabic also on religion, on trauma, dealing with trauma, because both sides, I think, of this conflict have experienced a lot of tragedy, and kind of just bringing settlers and Palestinians together. It's really the only group that exists that I know of that does anything like this, but because the more entrenched this conflict has gotten, I think even 10 years ago, I think they were getting more people to show up at their events that they plan. I think now it's even fewer. And the other issue that they really have a hard time dealing with is getting funding, because on the right, or Israelis might not be okay with dealing with Palestinians, and on the left, people even abroad aren't okay with something that's happening beyond the Green Line. I think a lot of Americans, even the government is not allowed. Certain times, American government isn't allowed to fund certain initiatives that are with settlers outside the Green Line. So even though this might be an interesting initiative, they're having a very hard time getting funding. And their budget's definitely shrunk, and it means the amount of activities that they can offer has gone down. But it does exist, and I think a lot of Israelis will tell you beyond the Green Line that, especially in the Gush Etzion area, that they often interact with Palestinians, and more often than people who talk about. I think in Tel Aviv you hear there's a more talk about the idea of peace and two-state solution, and why it's so important, but there are also people that don't really interact with Palestinians, as opposed to settlers who do really interact with them on a daily basis. They'll see them at Rami Levy. There's the shopping mall Rami Levy that's in the Gush Etzion region, and they all shop together. There's also these what are called industrial zones where Israelis and Palestinians work together, and they're trying to. There's more and more of them, and these are giving Palestinians a job and kind of better economic opportunity than they would be getting in the Palestinian Authority cities, administered cities. On the other hand, the issue with a lot of these places is that it's often not a real kind of even relationship.
I was just going to ask you about that.
A lot of the time, there are certain times where there are certain Palestinian bosses at these industrial zones, but a lot of times it's the Palestinians are kind of working for the Israelis. So while there is more interaction with them, and that should be maybe even encouraged, they're not really at an eye-to-eye level. And I think that has caused mainly a lot of people on the left to kind of resent that kind of relationship. But the point a broader point to be made is that there are, for the people who talk all the time about peace, the settlers often try to say that we are actually the ones that are willing and happy to deal more with Palestinians, and the more you try to divide us, it hasn't brought peace. They argue that Oslo, the Oslo period and trying to divide the land has only brought the Intifada and further violence, and now we're further apart. Whereas opposed to before those things happened, we were all together.